Political parties and politicians are both governed and limited by unconstitutional and illegal policies, legislation and electoral systems they created, is to empower and protect themselves. These illegal laws and policies are enforced on the South African Aboriginal people declared colored, often by their own people as politicians and law enforcement employees. These illegal laws, policies, and electoral acts politicians created to protect themselves, is an affectation that allows foreign nationals to recognize these illegal laws and policies, to dispossess the South African colored people of South Africa's land and resource rights. This translates into fraud, theft, and gross human rights violations. The South African colored people's land and resource rights are currently under an illegally elected president, electoral system, and municipalities, driven and administered by political parties as politicians. References of these violations can be found in constitutional court judgments on land tenure, land reform, and electoral acts of 1993, 2004, and 2013. Most incriminating and damning is the 2018 ConCourt judgment, declaring the Independent Electoral Commission system unconstitutional and illegal, as well as the 2019 judgment, that is very specific on how the Land Tenure Acts including the Tran-Cat, is illegal and unconstitutional. Let us simplify this for you. The current ANC-led nationalist government, legislators, parliament, National Assembly, national prosecution agencies and municipalities are currently all in contempt of court. These currently unconstitutional and illegally elected political parties and politicians, often the colored's own people as politicians, are promoting and protecting the ANC government and the other policy-based parties they are voluntary part of, for financial gain. They call this stipend their salary. By doing so, politicians has cunningly and illegally maintained the administration to your colored person's communal reserves trust land and resource rights, as per Act 3 of 1961. Let's start with why. Their primary drive is to enrich themselves and alienate you, the Aboriginal people of South Africa declared colored from your land rights, mining rights, petroleum rights, agriculture rights, forestry rights, fishing rights, and water rights amongst many more, with alienation policies or acts. The nationalist-led apartheid government, as well as the current nationalist ANC-led political party, or policy-based governments, has illegally administered, transferred, and sold the Aboriginal people of South Africa declared colored's land and resource rights. Stay tuned for when we reveal the processes how your land was stolen. Let me explain as to how the national apartheid and the nationalist ANC governments did they do this. Political parties and politicians meticulously crafted elaborate policies from as early as 1910, with recent judgments against legislations based on such political designed policies, declared unconstitutional and illegal. Instead of transferring the colored person's reserves trust land, its administration, and the substantial trust funds to the colored people, the rightful beneficiaries, the nationalist-led apartheid government used the Missionaries Stations Alienation Act No. 9 of 1911 to maintain the administration for themselves in 1958. The colored people's land and resource rights were alienated from them in the form of farms, cities, towns, Bantustans like Transkei, Venda, and the Ciskei by issuing grants, illegal title deeds, and PTO, permission to occupy. All this land and resource rights, together with trust assets, was taken out of the colored person's communal reserves trust, without prior consent of the trust beneficiaries, the colored people. The nationalist-led Broederbond signed a treaty with the British in 1945. They did this because they desired to establish the Union State of South Africa as their own, while simultaneously avoiding international war crimes for genocide, by excluding and alienating the colored people from their land and stealing the resources. For their plan to succeed, they had to get participation from the colored people, to keep the international human rights bodies and criminal courts illusioned. To maintain this international illusion, the nationalist-led apartheid politicians founded the National Party during the 1950s, created a tricameral parliament, and within it they designed and legislated, the colored House of Representatives under leadership of politicians Tom Swartz, Sonny Leon, and Alethea Jansen. The House of Representatives was a disaster for the colored people. The colored people were dragged into a westernized political system with unconstitutional and illegal voting processes that allowed a few to decide the fate of many. These representative politicians were mostly apartheid education system indoctrinated academics, such as reverends, teachers, and the peak of educational indoctrination, the title of doctorate, or doctor as proof thereof. With the limitations of these indoctrinations, the few colored politicians in the colored House of Representatives, together with the nationalist-led apartheid government politicians, forged ahead with their genocide policies and laws, by creating and implementing Act 9 of 1987. This act was to repeal the Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust Act 3 of 1961. But they had one problem. The nationalist-led apartheid government politicians have already made themselves guilty of land rights theft, resource theft, fraud, and genocide, by not transferring the Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust land administration, its resource rights, and the trust funds to the colored people. The nationalist-led apartheid government and their politicians had neither the legality, nor the jurisdiction to create and implement any legislation. These processes was recognized as illegal by international human rights bodies, criminal courts and governments, resulting in pressure via sanctions that forced the nationalist apartheid government politicians by 1988, to apply a new strategic alienation policy, for them to maintain their illegal administration, over the Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust land and the colored people's resource rights. Negotiations with the policy-based ANC politicians began in earnest. A new breed of politics was created, and the ANC and their alliance partner politicians became known as cadres, traditionally natives from East, West, and North Africa, and the historically colonists, primarily from Holland, Britain, and other European countries, became known as the opposition. That there are now political parties with many different names would make no difference, as their purpose is the same: to alienate and steal the Aboriginal people declared colored of South Africa's land and resources with policies and laws. One such policy is the Transformation of Certain Rural Areas Act 94 of 1998, also known as the Trunka Act. This act further alienated the colored people even more of their land and resource rights. The Trunka Act was problematic from the start, for the nationalist apartheid government politicians as well as the rebranded black nationalists. In 2018 the electoral system, and in 2019 the Trunka Act was judged unconstitutional and illegal for the third time. Let us explore why the Trunka is unconstitutional. The Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust land, resources, and funds, are all protected under Section 25 of the South African Constitution, that the current ANC-led nationalist government and their politicians want to repeal as an impediment. In violation of the Constitution, the Trunka Act was initiated and gazetted, but never signed off by the nationalist ANC-led government's president, also a politician, as he would then be impeached. This did not stop political parties and politicians from implementing the illegal Trunka Act throughout municipalities with devastating results. To summarize the devastation, we only have to look at the 2018 electoral system judgment, and the 2019 Constitutional Court judgment on land tenure on August 20, 2019. The committee was very specifically briefed, by the nationalist ANC-led Government Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, on the implications of the Constitutional Court judgment on the Land Tenure Rights Act, and that it was illegal. They also referred to the damning legacy reports of the previous portfolio committees on agriculture, forestry, fisheries, rural development, and land reform. These legacy